Lena had always loved the quiet streets of her town, where the old brick buildings seemed to hold memories that whispered in the wind. She was walking home after a long day at the small local newspaper where she worked, her bag swinging against her hip and the soft drizzle making her coat cling to her shoulders. Even in the rain, the town felt alive, though most people were hurrying past without really noticing the world around them. Lena, however, had a habit of seeing the small details: the broken fence by the park, the faded sign of the bakery that had stood for decades, the stray cat hiding under a bench. On that day, as she passed the park, something caught her eye. On a damp, worn-out bench sat an old man, hunched over with a ragged coat pulled tightly around him. His hair was a silvery white, tangled and unkempt, and his face had lines that spoke of years of hardship and loneliness. He wasn't asking for money or food. He simply sat there quietly, like a shadow of the life he had once lived. People walked past him without even a glance, their umbrellas and hurried steps keeping them separate from the world he inhabited. Lena felt a pull in her chest, a mix of curiosity and concern. She slowed her pace, pretending to look at her phone, but really watching him. There was something in the way he held himself, a dignity that refused to disappear even in the face of neglect. She knew that feeling, the quiet strength that comes from surviving when the world has forgotten you. Tentatively, she approached him. "Excuse me," she said softly. The man looked up, his eyes a pale gray, wary and cautious. He didn't speak immediately, just studied her, as if trying to decide if she was safe or not. "Hi," she continued gently. "My name is Lena. I just wanted to see if you're okay." He hesitated, and then, almost as if a door had opened, he said, "I'm fine, thank you." His voice was quiet, but there was a softness to it that made her heart ache. Lena smiled. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to, but I'd love to hear your story if you ever feel like sharing it." For a long moment, the old man said nothing. Then with a small sigh, he gave a faint nod. "I suppose it's been a long time since anyone asked." They sat there in silence for a while, listening to the rain pattering on the leaves above them. Lena offered him a thermos of tea she had brought, and after a pause, he accepted it. She learned his name was Mr. Anwar. He had been a schoolteacher once, loved by his students and respected by the community. But life had not been kind. He had lost his family in a tragic accident years ago, and without anyone to look after him, he eventually drifted into poverty and isolation. He spoke of the past with a mixture of pride and sadness, remembering the bright days when children would run into his classroom with laughter, the smell of chalk and old books filling the air. Lena listened intently, her notebook resting on her lap. Though she hadn't yet opened it, she wanted to remember everything, not to exploit him, but to honor the life he had lived. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the way his eyes would light up when he mentioned a former student or a moment of kindness he had witnessed. She realized that this man, who the world had written off as forgotten, carried stories and wisdom that were more valuable than anything money could buy. Over the next few days, Lena found herself returning to the park to see him again. Each time he would tell her more stories about the students he had taught, the challenges he had faced, the moments of joy that had kept him going. There was a rhythm to their meetings, a gentle building of trust. Lena discovered that Mr. Anwar had a sharp mind and a deep understanding of people, despite the years of hardship. He spoke with clarity about life's unfairness, but also about resilience and hope. She realized that his voice, which had been silenced by society's indifference, had the power to touch others if it was shared. She wanted to give him a chance to be heard, not as a beggar or a sad figure, but as a man who had lived a full life and still had wisdom to offer. She thought about how many people like him existed, invisible to the world, carrying untold stories that could inspire, teach, or simply remind others of the value of human connection. One afternoon, as the rain began to let up and the sky cleared just enough for a faint sun to peek through, Lena finally opened her notebook. "Would it be okay if I wrote some of your stories? Maybe share them with people in the town?" she asked. Mr. Anwar looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly, a mix of pride and embarrassment crossing his features. I don't know," he said slowly. "People don't usually want to hear about someone like me. My life is unremarkable now." "You never know," Lena replied softly. "Sometimes the simplest stories are the ones that touch people the most. And your life isn't unremarkable. You taught generations, shaped minds, and faced hardships with dignity. That matters." He was silent for a long moment, and then, with a faint smile, he nodded. "All right, we can try, but you must promise me one thing." "Anything," Lena said without hesitation. "You must tell it as it is. No embellishments. No making me sound better than I am. Just the truth. I promise," she said. Feeling a surge of excitement and responsibility, she knew this was the beginning of something important, not just for him, but for the community that had forgotten him. From that day on, their conversations became a routine. Lena would visit with her notebook, and Mr. Anwar would share pieces of his life. He spoke of the pride he felt when a student finally understood a difficult lesson, of the small joys in everyday moments, of the heartbreak he carried in silence for so many years. Lena took careful notes, capturing not just facts, but the emotions, the pauses, the laughter, and the tears. As the days turned into weeks, Lena began to see subtle changes in Mr. Anwar. He seemed more engaged with the world around him, greeting passers-by with a nod or a smile, talking to stray animals as if they were old friends. The park, which had once seemed dull and empty, now held a sense of possibility, a quiet stage for the rebirth of a man's voice. Lena felt a deep sense of purpose. She was not just documenting a story, she was helping someone reclaim his place in the world. One chilly morning, Lena brought a small umbrella and some biscuits she had baked. She offered them to Mr. Anwar, who chuckled softly at the gesture. "You really care about these small things, don't you?" he asked. "I think the small things are what matter most," Lena replied. "Sometimes they are the only things that remind us we are alive and that someone cares." He nodded, taking a biscuit and breaking it in half. "I suppose I've been alive, but not always living," he said quietly. "You can start living again," Lena said gently. "And the best part is you don't have to do it alone." Mr. Anwar looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to imagine that his life still had meaning, that his experiences could help others, and that he could be remembered not for his struggles alone, but for the wisdom he carried. Lena walked home that evening feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She knew that the work ahead would not be easy. She would have to navigate Mr. Anwar's hesitations, the judgments of others, and the delicate task of honoring his story without overstepping. But she also knew that some stories were worth the effort, and some people were worth believing in even when the world had forgotten them. The rain had stopped, leaving a fresh, clean scent in the air. Streetlights reflected on the wet pavement, creating a mosaic of light and shadow. Lena felt as if she had stepped into a new chapter of her life, one that promised purpose, discovery, and the quiet joy of making a difference. And somewhere in the park, on a bench that had once been overlooked, a forgotten man sat, slowly opening his heart to the world again, one story at a time. Over the next few weeks, Lena continued visiting Mr. Anwar at the park. Each meeting became a small ritual, a bridge that slowly closed the distance between a life forgotten and someone willing to listen. She arrived with her notebook, a thermos of tea, and sometimes little snacks she baked herself. At first, he would barely take more than a few sips of tea, his eyes downcast as if unsure whether he deserved the attention. But Lena was patient. She never rushed him. She simply listened, and over time, he began to talk more freely. Mr. Anwar shared stories about his childhood, about his parents who had loved learning and instilled in him a deep respect for knowledge. He spoke about his first days as a teacher, when he nervously stood in front of a classroom filled with expectant faces, and how one small act of encouragement from a fellow teacher had changed the trajectory of his career. His voice would sometimes tremble as he recalled the past, but Lena stayed calm, making notes quietly, always aware that the most important thing was his comfort, not the speed of her writing. One rainy afternoon, Lena asked him about his students, curious to understand the impact he had made on their lives. He smiled faintly, eyes brightening despite the grayness of the day. He spoke about a boy who had struggled to read but, with patience and encouragement, had gone on to become a writer. He talked about a shy girl who had become a community leader, always remembering the teacher who had believed in her. These stories painted a picture of a life full of meaning, even if the world outside the park had forgotten it. Lena began to notice changes in herself as well. She had always been observant, but spending time with Mr. Anwar opened her. eyes to the subtle details of humanity she had sometimes overlooked. She saw courage in his endurance, wisdom in his quiet observations, and hope in his ability to continue caring for life despite loss and hardship. She realized that there was a deep well of knowledge in people who were often overlooked by society, and she wanted to find a way to bring those stories to the wider world. One afternoon, as they sat on the damp bench watching children play in the distance, Lena gently asked, "Do you ever feel like people don't understand you anymore? Like your voice is lost?" Mr. Anwar was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "I spent decades guiding others, teaching them, shaping their futures, but now, it feels like none of that matters. People walk past me as if I'm invisible." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and Lena placed a comforting hand on his arm. "It does matter," she said softly, "and I want to help people see that. Your voice has value. Your experiences can teach others even now." He looked at her, a mix of doubt and cautious hope in his gaze. "You think anyone would listen?" he asked. Lena smiled. "I know they will if they hear it from you. I'll help share your stories, but only your truth. No exaggeration, no embellishments. Just your life, your experiences." People respond to honesty more than anything else. That day, they began working together in a more intentional way. Mr. Anwar would recount his memories, sometimes laughing at a moment of youthful foolishness, sometimes growing somber as he recalled loss. Lena wrote everything down carefully, capturing not just the words but the emotion behind them. She learned to notice the small cues, when his hands trembled with excitement or when a pause carried more meaning than any sentence could. She understood that a true story was not just about events but about the feelings that lived within those moments. As weeks passed, Mr. Anwar began to open up about his struggles as a teacher in the earlier days of his career. He spoke about the lack of resources, the challenges of motivating students who faced difficulties at home, and the satisfaction of seeing them overcome obstacles. Lena could see the pride in his eyes, a pride that had been buried under years of isolation and hardship. The park, once merely a place of passing time, became a sanctuary for sharing knowledge, memories, and trust. One morning, as the first hints of sunlight warmed the damp earth, Lena asked Mr. Anwar about his life after his family was gone. The question made him flinch at first, but he eventually spoke. He described how he had wandered the streets seeking work and connection, only to find doors closed and faces averted. People had seen his appearance, his poverty, and judged him without knowing his history. Yet despite the rejection, he had maintained a quiet dignity, never asking for more than the bare minimum, always remembering the lessons he had taught about respect, honesty, and kindness. Lena was moved by his resilience. She realized that many people might have given up long ago, but Mr. Anwar had endured, surviving in a society that had ignored him. She wanted to honor that endurance. She began to consider how she could introduce him to the wider community in a way that respected his privacy, yet highlighted his wisdom and humanity. It was not about pity or charity. It was about recognition and the power of storytelling to change perceptions. On a chilly afternoon, they sat together under a tree, watching a few birds hop along the wet grass. Lena asked if he remembered the students who had gone on to make a difference in the world. He nodded, and for the first time in weeks his eyes sparkled with a mixture of pride and longing. "They carry pieces of me with them," he said. "Even if I am forgotten, parts of my life live on in them." Lena felt a lump in her throat. She realized that his impact had never truly disappeared. It had just gone unnoticed, and now with her help it could be seen again. They began experimenting with sharing short anecdotes informally. Lena would recount a story in a casual conversation with her colleagues, always careful to respect Mr. Anwar's privacy. The responses were encouraging. People were surprised, moved, and curious. They wanted to know more about the man they had ignored for so long. Mr. Anwar, once hesitant and self-conscious, began to smile more openly, encouraged by the subtle change in the way others began to perceive him. One evening, as they packed up their things and prepared to leave, Mr. Anwar turned to Lena and said, "I never imagined anyone would care enough to listen. You have given me more than I can say." Lena shook her head gently. "You gave yourself the courage to speak. I just helped you share it. The rest is you." They walked together toward the park exit side by side, a partnership forming between two people who had found in each other a rare trust and understanding. As the days continued, Lena thought more about how to share his stories with the broader community. She wanted the stories to reach people in a way that was authentic and touching. She began drafting small pieces for the newspaper, carefully editing them to capture the essence of Mr. Anwar's experiences without sensationalizing them. Each article focused on a different aspect of his life: his early years, his teaching career, his philosophy on life, and the simple joys he had found even in hard times. By the end of the month, Lena noticed a subtle change in the park itself. Regular passers-by started acknowledging Mr. Anwar with a nod or a friendly greeting. People who once ignored him now paused briefly to exchange a word or smile. It was not a grand transformation, but it was enough to signal that a man once forgotten was slowly being seen again. Lena realized that change often began with small, consistent actions, and that even quiet gestures could ripple outward to create a larger impact. One day, as they shared tea and watched a young couple walk by, Mr. Anwar spoke quietly. "I feel lighter," he said. "Sharing these stories, being seen again, it reminds me that life still has meaning, that I still have something to give." Lena smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest. This was exactly what she had hoped for: a rekindling of spirit, a restoration of hope, and a gentle return to life for a man who had been invisible for far too long. Lena understood that their journey had just begun. There were still challenges ahead, and she would need to tread carefully to respect his dignity while bringing his voice to the world. But she also knew that something important had been set in motion: a partnership between a young woman willing to listen and a man willing to speak, and the promise of stories that could touch hearts and change perspectives. And so they continued to meet day after day, weaving together the threads of a life once hidden into a tapestry that would slowly, surely be seen by others. After several weeks of meeting and sharing stories, Lena felt ready to take the next step. She had carefully compiled Mr. Anwar's memories, reflections, and lessons into short, heartfelt pieces. She decided to submit them to the local newspaper, not as a single feature but as a series, each article highlighting a different aspect of his life. She hoped that by telling his story slowly and naturally, people in the town would begin to see him not as a forgotten figure, but as a person with a life rich in experience and wisdom. The first article was simple, yet moving. It introduced Mr. Anwar as a former teacher who had once shaped the minds of countless children, and it recounted some of the smaller, poignant moments of his career. Lena emphasized his quiet dignity, the kindness he had shown, and the ways in which he had touched the lives of those around him. She deliberately avoided dramatizing his hardships, instead focusing on the humanity and lessons embedded in his life. When the article was published, Lena was nervous. She didn't know how the town would react, but the response was immediate and unexpectedly warm. A few people recognized him and stopped to speak, offering words of gratitude and encouragement. Some were moved to tears, recalling their own experiences as students or remembering someone they had lost. Slowly, Mr. Anwar's world began to change. The town that had once ignored him now paused to acknowledge his presence. Encouraged by the reaction, Lena continued with the series. She highlighted his personal philosophy, the stories of students who had succeeded against odds, and his reflections on life's challenges. She included anecdotes that showcased his humor, cleverness, and insight, painting a picture of a man whose life had been anything but ordinary. The article sparked conversations among readers, many of whom admitted they had walked past Mr. Anwar countless times without a second thought. Now they began to see the value in paying attention to those society tends to overlook. As the articles ran week after week, more people began to approach him in the park. Children, intrigued by the stories Lena had shared, came to listen to his lessons about life and learning. Adults who had once passed him by paused to greet him and even offered small gestures of kindness: a hot drink, a shared umbrella, or a simple smile. Mr. Anwar's demeanor slowly shifted. The hesitance that had shadowed his expressions was replaced with quiet pride and an emerging joy. He seemed lighter, as if the act of being seen and acknowledged was lifting a burden he had carried for years. One day, Lena suggested holding a small gathering in the park so that Mr. Anwar could speak directly to those who were interested in hearing his stories. She arranged benches under the trees and invited anyone who might want to attend. To Lena's surprise, many people showed up. Children sat cross-legged on the grass while adults lingered, curious to learn more about the man who had suddenly become the center of so much attention. Mr. Anwar was nervous at first, unused to having so many eyes on him. But as he began to speak, telling a story about a young student who had overcome immense obstacles, his voice grew stronger. The audience listened in rapt silence, occasionally breaking into laughter at his humorous anecdotes or nodding thoughtfully at his reflections. Lena watched him closely, thrilled by the transformation. Mr. Anwar was no longer just a forgotten figure on a park bench. He was a storyteller, a mentor, and a living testament to resilience and human kindness. She realized that her role was not only to share his story, but also to create spaces where he could reclaim his own voice. The act of speaking, of being acknowledged, had begun to heal wounds that years of isolation had left. Word of the park gathering spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Soon people from nearby towns began attending. Some came simply out of curiosity, others with the hope of learning lessons from someone who had experienced so much. The gatherings were informal yet deeply moving. Children would ask questions, adults would share their own reflections, and Mr. Anwar would respond thoughtfully, offering wisdom that was practical, heartfelt, and simple. Lena noticed that these sessions were as much for him as for the audience. Each story shared, each laugh, each moment of recognition seemed to restore pieces of his self-worth. The local newspaper featured photos of the gatherings, capturing the smiles of children and the attentive expressions of adults. Lena made sure the images reflected the warmth and authenticity of the events, not as a spectacle but as a genuine human connection. The community began to see Mr. Anwar differently, not as a man defined by loss and hardship, but as a symbol of the power of storytelling, empathy, and quiet resilience. As the weeks continued, Lena encouraged Mr. Anwar to share some practical advice as well. He spoke about patience, the importance of listening, the value of empathy, and the ways small acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways people might never realize. He shared stories about problem-solving in the classroom, about how understanding the challenges children faced outside school could transform the way one approached teaching. His words were not lofty or abstract. They were grounded in real experiences, and that made them resonate deeply with his audience. The more Mr. Anwar spoke, the more the town began to transform around him. People started to notice others who were often overlooked: the elderly man who sat quietly on a bench, the woman struggling with groceries, the child left out on the playground. Lena saw these moments as proof that the impact of a single voice, amplified by attention and care, could change perceptions and attitudes. Mr. Anwar's story had become a mirror, reflecting back to the community their own capacity for compassion and connection. One evening, after a particularly engaging gathering, Lena and Mr. Anwar walked home together through the park, the evening light casting long shadows on the paths. Mr. Anwar was quiet for a while, taking in the scene and the small but noticeable signs of change in the people they passed. Finally, he turned to Lena and said softly, "I never thought I would feel seen again. I thought the world had forgotten me. But you showed me that there is still value in a life lived quietly, in ways that may not always be recognized." Lena smiled, feeling a mixture of gratitude and humility. "You always had that value, Mr. Anwar. I just helped remind others and you that it exists." He nodded thoughtfully, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. The series of articles in the newspaper, combined with the park gatherings, had started to create a ripple effect. People began approaching Lena with stories of other forgotten individuals in the community, seeking ways to share their voices and experiences. She realized that Mr. Anwar's journey was not just about his own rediscovery, but about awakening the town to the importance of listening, empathy, and human connection. She began thinking of ways to extend these gatherings, perhaps even including workshops or reading sessions, so that the wisdom of people like Mr. Anwar could reach even more lives. Through it all, Mr. Anwar continued to grow in confidence. His eyes sparkled with curiosity again, and his smile was more frequent. The hesitancy that had shadowed him for so long was replaced with a quiet strength. He was beginning to understand that the world could be gentle, that people could care, and that his voice mattered. And as he shared his stories, he noticed the subtle changes in those around him, the recognition, the respect, the warmth that came from simply acknowledging a life that had been overlooked. Lena reflected on the transformation with a sense of awe. She had started simply as someone who cared enough to listen, and yet the act of sharing Mr. Anwar's life had touched the community in profound ways. She realized that sometimes change does not come from grand gestures or public declarations, but from consistent, sincere attention to one individual, which can then ripple outward, affecting many others. By the end of this chapter of their journey, the park was no longer just a place of solitude for a forgotten man. It had become a space of learning, connection, and reflection. Mr. Anwar had reclaimed his voice and, in doing so, had reminded the community of the power of listening, empathy, and the quiet dignity of every human life. Lena knew that the path ahead still held challenges, but she also knew that with patience, care, and determination, the stories they shared could continue to move hearts and create lasting change. The weeks passed and Mr. Anwar's presence in the town grew stronger. What had started as a few curious glances and polite nods now became genuine engagement. People who once walked past him without a second thought now greeted him by name. Children came running to hear him speak before heading to school, and adults lingered for a few minutes listening intently to stories that were full of wisdom, humor, and sometimes melancholy. Lena noticed that these simple interactions had a profound effect on him. The lines of weariness on his face softened, and his posture straightened with a quiet pride. One morning, Lena arrived at the park to find a small crowd already gathered. News of the previous week's gathering had spread, and people were eager to hear more. Mr. Anwar was slightly anxious at first, unused to so many eyes and ears focused on him. Lena stayed nearby, giving him a reassuring nod. He began by telling a story about a student who had faced enormous challenges at home, but found encouragement in small words and gestures of kindness. His voice, steady and warm, carried a message that touched everyone listening. As he spoke, Lena could see the impact in their faces. Some people teared up, others smiled knowingly, and a few even whispered among themselves, moved by his words. The gatherings became more organized over time. Lena helped arrange seating, refreshments, and even simple visual aids to make the stories more engaging. She wanted to create an environment where Mr. Anwar could shine, where his voice could be heard without distraction. Each story he shared was carefully chosen, highlighting different aspects of his life: the joys of teaching, the sorrow of loss, the lessons learned from resilience and empathy. His honesty and humility drew people in, creating a space where everyone felt connected to the shared human experience. Soon, local businesses and community members began contributing in small ways. A nearby bakery donated bread and tea for the gatherings, while a small bookstore offered books for children to borrow. Even the park's caretaker, who had once seen Mr. Anwar as just another homeless man, began helping set up benches and clearing paths. The town, slowly but surely, was changing around him, recognizing the value of a life that had been overlooked for so long. Lena suggested to Mr. Anwar that they might create a more permanent space for these gatherings. Perhaps a small reading corner in the park, or even a room at the local community center where he could share his stories regularly. He hesitated, unsure if he could manage such a responsibility, but Lena reassured him. "You don't have to do it alone," she said. "We'll do it together. People want to listen, and you have something valuable to give." As they planned, Mr. Anwar began mentoring young people more deliberately. Children who had shown interest in learning from him were invited to participate in short lessons, where he taught not only about academics, but about life, about patience, kindness, and resilience. He shared simple strategies for overcoming challenges, encouraging the young listeners to believe in themselves even when circumstances seemed unfair. Lena observed the transformation in both the children and the adults who watched them. The lessons were not just academic. They were lessons in humanity, empathy, and respect for oneself and others. The community's response was remarkable. People who had never spoken to one another began forming connections through Mr. Anwar's stories. Neighbors checked in on each other more often. Parents spent more time engaging with their children, and local groups began supporting small initiatives inspired by his wisdom. Lena realized that the impact of one voice, given the chance to be heard, could extend far beyond the individual, shaping the collective conscience of a town. One afternoon, Lena and Mr. Anwar were walking through the park after a gathering when a woman approached them. She introduced herself as a teacher from a nearby school who had read Lena's articles and wanted to bring her students to hear Mr. Anwar speak. She explained that her students came from underprivileged backgrounds and she believed his stories could inspire them. Mr. Anwar looked hesitant, but Lena encouraged him gently. "You have already touched so many lives. Think of this as helping more children find their own strength." He agreed, and the next week, the park hosted a larger gathering with the visiting students, who listened intently to his stories and asked thoughtful questions. These events became a regular occurrence. Mr. Anwar's voice reached beyond the town, inspiring people from neighboring areas. Lena carefully documented the gatherings not to boast or publicize, but to share the essence of what was happening. The stories were simple yet profound, reminding everyone that each life held lessons worth hearing, and that even small gestures of attention and care could transform the world around them. Lena noticed that Mr. Anwar's confidence continued to grow. He no longer hesitated to speak in front of a crowd. His humor emerged naturally, bringing laughter to the gatherings, and his observations about life resonated deeply with people of all ages. The once forgotten man was now a teacher again. But not just in the classroom, he was teaching life, empathy, and resilience to the entire community. One evening, as the sun set and painted the park in golden light, Mr. Anwar turned to Lena and said quietly, "I feel alive again. I never imagined I could feel this way after so many years of being invisible. You have given me more than words can say." Lena smiled, feeling a swell of warmth. "You gave yourself the courage to speak, and I just helped you share it. The world is listening now because it deserves to hear what you have to say." Their partnership had grown into something more profound than either of them had anticipated. It was no longer just about telling one man's story. It had become a movement of empathy, recognition, and human connection. People began to look at the world differently, noticing the overlooked, appreciating the quiet wisdom around them, and understanding that every life mattered. By the end of this chapter, the park had become a symbol of transformation. Mr. Anwar's voice was no longer silent, and the town was slowly learning to listen. The simple act of paying attention to one person's story had created ripples that extended far beyond what Lena or Mr. Anwar could have imagined. It was a quiet revolution, one of understanding, compassion, and recognition, a proof that even in a world that often overlooks the vulnerable, kindness and attention could restore dignity and inspire change. Lena knew that there was still work to be done. They would continue to share stories, mentor young people, and create spaces where forgotten voices could be heard. But she also knew that the most important lesson had already been learned. When someone gives a voice to the unheard, it can awaken the best in everyone who listens. Mr. Anwar had found his voice again, and in doing so, he had reminded the town of the beauty and power of human connection, one story at a time. Over time, the story of Mr. Anwar and the gatherings in the park became widely known throughout the town. The quiet man who had once been invisible now held a respected place in the hearts of those who lived there. People had started sharing their own stories of struggle, loss, and hope, inspired by his courage to speak and Lena's dedication to listening. Mr. Anwar's journey had created a ripple effect, awakening a new sense of empathy and understanding among the townspeople. One bright morning, the local community center approached Lena with an idea. They wanted to dedicate a small space to stories and learning, a place where people like Mr. Anwar could share experiences, mentor children, and offer guidance to anyone willing to listen. Lena and Mr. Anwar visited the center together and walked through the empty rooms, imagining them filled with books, laughter, and conversations. Mr. Anwar looked around and smiled, a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. "I never thought I would see this day," he whispered. Lena squeezed his hand gently. "You've earned it, and now we can help others earn their voices too." They began organizing weekly sessions at the center. Children from local schools were invited to learn, not only from Mr. Anwar's lessons but also from the stories he told. Adults came as well, some curious, some seeking inspiration, and some simply wanting to understand the man they had overlooked for so long. Lena continued documenting the sessions, capturing the warmth and authenticity of each interaction. She focused on the natural flow of conversations, the laughter, the quiet moments of reflection, and the sense of community that was forming around them. Mr. Anwar's influence continued to grow. He became a mentor not just for children, but for adults who had lost their way, reminding them that it is never too late to find purpose or to reconnect with life. His stories emphasized resilience, empathy, and the power of small acts of kindness. He spoke of patience in the face of adversity, of hope when all seems lost, and of the importance of listening to others. The wisdom in his words resonated deeply, touching hearts and inspiring people to be more thoughtful, more considerate, and more present for one another. One afternoon, during a session with a group of children, a young girl approached Mr. Anwar shyly. She had been struggling with school and often felt invisible herself. With a gentle smile, Mr. Anwar invited her to sit beside him and shared a story about a student who had faced similar challenges but had found confidence and success through persistence and support. The girl's eyes widened with hope and a faint smile appeared on her face. Lena watched quietly, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and pride. This was the true impact of their work, transforming not just one life but many, one story at a time. The community center became a hub of learning and inspiration. People who had previously ignored each other began forming friendships. Neighbors reached out to offer help, and young people were encouraged to take an active role in their own communities. The change was subtle but profound. Lena saw the results in small gestures, people pausing to greet each other, children helping the elderly, strangers offering assistance without hesitation. It was as if the town had awakened to a new awareness, sparked by the voice of one man and the dedication of a woman willing to listen. As the months passed, Lena suggested creating a small booklet of Mr. Anwar's stories and reflections to be shared with the wider community and preserved for the future. He agreed, feeling honored but also humble. They spent weeks compiling the stories, carefully editing them to retain the authenticity and emotion of each moment. The booklet included not only tales of his past, but also his thoughts on life, empathy, and resilience. It became a cherished collection, a symbol of hope and inspiration for anyone who felt overlooked or unheard. The town held a special event to launch the booklet. The community center was filled with people eager to celebrate Mr. Anwar's life and the lessons he had shared. Children performed small skits based on his stories. Adults shared reflections on how his guidance had affected them, and Lena read excerpts from the booklet. Mr. Anwar stood quietly at the front, overwhelmed by the warmth and recognition surrounding him. He had never imagined such a moment could exist in his life, and yet here it was, a culmination of years of silence now replaced with understanding, respect, and love. During the celebration, Mr. Anwar spoke to the audience. His voice was steady, filled with emotion, as he expressed gratitude for the attention, care, and respect he had received. He spoke not just of his own journey, but of the importance of noticing those who are often overlooked, of listening with empathy, and of sharing knowledge and kindness whenever possible. The room was silent, every person present hanging on his words. Lena watched, feeling tears prick at her eyes, knowing that their work had created something far greater than either of them could have imagined. After the event, people approached Mr. Anwar and Lena, thanking them for inspiring change, for reminding the town of the power of listening and understanding. Some shared their own stories of hardship, others offered support for future sessions, and many simply expressed gratitude for being reminded of what it means to care for others. The once forgotten man had become a beacon of hope, a living testament to the power of empathy and attention. Lena realized that the true value of their work was not in recognition or praise, but in the change it had inspired, the transformation of individual hearts and, collectively, the soul of the community. As weeks turned into months, the community continued to thrive with the lessons Mr. Anwar shared. The park and the community center became symbols of inclusion and human connection. People began looking for ways to help each other, inspired by the example he had set. Children who had once felt invisible now stood taller, encouraged by his guidance. Adults who had been caught up in the busyness of life paused to notice the world and the people around them. The ripple effect of one voice, amplified by care and attention, had created a more compassionate and connected town. One quiet evening, after a long day of teaching and sharing stories, Mr. Anwar sat on a bench in the park, looking out at the children playing and the adults conversing. Lena joined him, offering a cup of tea. They sat in companionable silence, both reflecting on how far they had come. Mr. Anwar finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "I never imagined life could be this full. Again, I thought I was forgotten, but now I see that every life has meaning and every voice deserves to be heard. Lena smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. You gave your voice and people listened. You reminded everyone, including me, that paying attention and caring for others can change lives. Mr. Anwar nodded, a gentle smile on his face. And it all began with someone willing to listen. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Lena reached out and held his hand, understanding that the journey they had shared had not only given him back his voice, but had also transformed her own understanding of empathy, human connection, and the power of storytelling. As the sun set and the park was bathed in a warm golden glow, Lena and Mr. Anwar watched the town around them, knowing that their work had created a lasting impact. The forgotten man had found his voice, and in doing so, had reminded everyone that even the quietest lives can shine brightly when met with attention, care, and respect. The story they had written together was not just about one life reclaimed, but about the potential within each of us to notice, listen, and transform the world, one story at a time. Months had passed since the booklet of Mr. Anwar's stories had been released, and the town had transformed in subtle but powerful ways. The park and community center had become places of gathering, learning, and inspiration. People who had once been indifferent now approached life with more awareness and compassion. Children were more confident, adults were more attentive to the needs of others, and a sense of community had taken root where there had once been only passing strangers. Lena observed these changes with a mixture of pride and humility, knowing that all it had taken was a willingness to listen and to share a voice that had long been ignored. One crisp morning, Lena arrived at the park to find Mr. Anwar already seated on his usual bench, watching the sunrise. The golden light illuminated his silver hair, and his eyes held a calm contentment. Lena greeted him quietly, not wanting to disturb the serenity of the moment. Mr. Anwar looked at her and smiled warmly. It feels different now, he said softly. I wake up and there is purpose again. I never thought I would feel this way after so many years. Lena nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. He had reclaimed not just his voice, but a sense of meaning that had been lost long ago. That day they began preparing for a new initiative. Lena had spoken with local schools and community groups, proposing a series of workshops where Mr. Anwar could share his stories and lessons more broadly. This would not only allow more people to learn from his experiences, but also create a platform for others to share their own voices. Mr. Anwar had initially been hesitant, worried about speaking to larger groups and whether his message would resonate. Lena reassured him that authenticity mattered more than presentation, and that his wisdom could touch lives in ways he might never fully understand. The first workshop was held in a small auditorium at the community center. Children and adults filled the seats, curious and eager to hear from the man who had inspired so many in the park. Lena introduced him, speaking briefly about his journey, from invisibility to recognition, and then stepped back. Mr. Anwar began slowly, recounting a story from his early teaching days, his voice steady and warm. He spoke of patience, empathy, and the power of encouragement. The audience listened intently, some nodding thoughtfully, others wiping away tears, and a few smiling at the humor woven into his anecdotes. As the sessions continued over the following weeks, Mr. Anwar's confidence grew. He began to explore deeper topics, discussing not only the joys of teaching, but the lessons he had learned from hardship, grief, and perseverance. Lena observed how these discussions sparked reflection among the participants. Adults shared experiences from their own lives, children asked thoughtful questions, and the workshops became a collaborative space for learning and connection. The once forgotten man had become a mentor, a guide, and a symbol of resilience for the entire community. During one session, a teenage boy stood up hesitantly to ask a question. He had been struggling in school and felt invisible in his own family. Mr. Anwar listened carefully, offering encouragement and a story about a student who had faced similar challenges but found strength through perseverance and the support of those who cared. The boy's eyes brightened, and a smile slowly formed on his face. Lena felt a surge of pride, realizing that the lessons Mr. Anwar shared were transforming lives in real, tangible ways. Word of the workshop spread, drawing attention from nearby towns. People came seeking guidance, inspiration, and the opportunity to hear a story that reminded them of the power of human connection. Lena carefully documented these events, not for recognition, but to preserve the lessons and wisdom being shared. She took notes on the questions asked, the insights offered, and the moments of genuine connection between Mr. Anwar and the audience. Each story, each interaction, reinforced the idea that a single voice, when given attention and care, could ignite change on a much larger scale. One afternoon, after a particularly moving session, Lena and Mr. Anwar walked through the park, reflecting on the changes that had taken place. Mr. Anwar looked around, noting the children playing, the adults conversing, and the sense of community that now permeated the space. "It feels like a different world," he said quietly. "I never thought my voice could matter so much or that people would listen with such care." Lena smiled. "It's not just your voice. It's the stories you've shared, the lessons you've lived. People are learning from your life, and they are inspired to be better, to notice more, to care more." Inspired by the success of the workshops, Lena proposed creating a mentorship program, pairing experienced community members with children and young adults who could benefit from guidance and encouragement. Mr. Anwar enthusiastically supported the idea, seeing it as an extension of the lessons he had always valued. The program emphasized empathy, resilience, and active listening, encouraging participants to share their experiences and learn from one another. Lena coordinated the logistics, while Mr. Anwar provided the guidance and stories that formed the foundation of the curriculum. As the mentorship program grew, Lena noticed a remarkable transformation in both mentors and mentees. Adults rediscovered the value of their own experiences, children gained confidence, and the town began to thrive as a more compassionate, connected community. The ripple effect of one man's voice had multiplied, reaching far beyond what anyone had imagined. Mr. Anwar's quiet wisdom had become a catalyst for collective growth and understanding, proving that even lives that seem forgotten can leave a lasting impact. One evening, after a long day of workshops and mentoring, Mr. Anwar and Lena sat together in the park watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, reflecting the warmth that had grown within the community. Mr. Anwar turned to Lena, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I never imagined life could be this full again," he said softly. "I thought I was invisible, forgotten, but now I see the difference a single life can make. And it is more than I ever hoped for." Lena reached out and gently held his hand. "You gave your voice and people listened. That's the power of simply sharing your life, your stories, and your wisdom." The town had changed, and in many ways, so had Lena. She had learned the profound impact of listening, of caring deeply, and of taking the time to honor voices that society often overlooks. Together, she and Mr. Anwar had created more than just stories. They had built a legacy of empathy, human connection, and the belief that every life has value. The once forgotten man had become a symbol of resilience, hope, and inspiration, touching lives far beyond the park and the community center. As night fell and the park grew quiet, Lena reflected on their journey. It had begun with a simple act of noticing someone who had been ignored, offering attention, and listening without judgment. That act had blossomed into a movement of compassion and understanding, reminding everyone that even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. Mr. Anwar's journey from invisibility to recognition had inspired a town, showing that every life holds lessons worth sharing, and every story has the potential to change hearts. Sitting together on the bench, Lena and Mr. Anwar watched the stars appear, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment. Their work was far from over, but the foundation they had built was strong. The park and the community center had become beacons of hope and learning, and the lessons shared would continue to ripple outward, touching lives for years to come. In the quiet of the night, they both understood the simple truth that had guided them all along. When someone gives voice to the unheard, the world listens, hearts are changed, and even forgotten lives can shine brightly once more.